Please welcome the George W. Bush Institute's Director of Economic Growth, Matthew Rooney.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Matthew, and I am a globalist. But I'm not a globalist because I'm some kind of citizen of the world. I'm a globalist because I'm an American, that is, a person who was born of English and German and Irish roots in Pennsylvania, raised in California and Massachusetts, and came of age in Texas. I'm a globalist because a career as a Foreign Service officer representing our country in Europe and Africa and Latin America taught me at first hand the irresistible power of this country's positive sun understanding of the world. So as a globalist and as an American, I find it increasingly perplexing to see more and more Americans considering the two to be mutually exclusive, as though globalization were some kind of threat to our identity as Americans, as though globalization were a game that's stacked against us that we can't possibly win. That's particularly ironic if you consider that globalization as it exists today is actually an American idea. It started in American diplomacy in the years after the Second World War, and in fact took on critical mass at what I would argue is a very precisely identifiable point in time. 9:30 p.m. Central European time on November 9th, 1989. At that moment, the East German government declared that East Germans were free to travel. At that moment, the Berlin Wall was reduced to an artifact, and the Cold War was over. It was a great victory for the United States and a great opportunity. Billions of people who had walled themselves off from the global economy tore down those walls, literally, and reached for the prosperity that we had told them the global economy could provide. The United States responded to this unique opportunity with a whole series of proposals for how to organize this post-Cold War global economy. WTO, NAFTA. All of these proposals which shaped that environment rooted in American practices and American principles. In effect, those billions of newly freed people did what we had been advising them to do for most of a century. They worked, they invented, they manufactured, they imported, they exported, they competed. And it worked. Across the world, governments withdrew from vast swaths of the marketplace. Consumer and entrepreneurial freedom rose like a tide, and billions of people were lifted out of poverty. And then came September 15th, 2008. That day and the crisis that followed and the recession that followed was a vast human tragedy. And it left many people around the world and around the United States wondering if maybe the American model's played out. We'd had a good run, but maybe the Chinese model of neo-mercantilist, state-led capitalism is better suited to the realities of today, where Xi Jinping is all of a sudden president for life. Here at the Bush Institute, we don't think so. We've looked at the globalization process since NAFTA was signed. We've looked at its ability and its impacts on our ability to thrive and grow as an economy, to create jobs, and to compete in the international marketplace. We've looked at the impact of immigrants on our economy. And we see a largely positive picture of rising prosperity driven by stable demographics and innovation and productivity. But we recognize that there are many people in this country who don't see it that way. And we recognize it is incumbent upon us to offer a considered response. So in an effort to do that, as Ken Hirsch mentioned earlier today, we have joined together with our friends at Southern Methodist University to form the Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative. This is a truly exciting and interesting new initiative. I see a number of my partners in this initiative are with us today, a number of members of the SMU community. We're going to come together and we're going to take the Bush Institute's action-oriented approach to policy, our extraordinary ability to convene, which we're seeing here today, and the economic scholarship and excellence of SMU, and use that to offer solutions, policy solutions, for how to promote domestic economic growth and strengthen our international competitiveness as a nation. I want to invite everybody here today to join us to watch this space in the second half of this year as we launch this initiative and start to give it shape, and to give us your feedback and your reactions as we build it into a globally respected voice on the most pressing economic issues of our time. On the subject of the most pressing economic issues of our time, the conversation that we'd like to have this afternoon engages some of the most respected leading voices on these issues of our country. We're joined this afternoon by Ben Bernanke, a former chair of the Federal Reserve, who today is a distinguished visiting fellow in residence at the Brookings Institution; Hank Paulson, former Secretary of the Treasury and CEO of Goldman Sachs, who is chairman of the Paulson Institute at the University of Chicago; Ed Lazier, formerly chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors, who is a senior fellow at the Hoover Institution and a professor of economics at the Stanford Graduate School of Business. And we're delighted to have today, to moderate our conversation, Terence Duffy, CEO of CME Group, the world's leading and most diverse derivatives marketplace. Gentlemen, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you very much. It's been an amazing day. I want to thank President Bush and Laura Bush for inviting us to be here today. You know, we've heard from the women, you know, the lunch we had today with the women was just amazing. And Daniel's story, I mean, second to none, my fellow Chicagoan. Mrs. Bush, thank you very much. And then we heard from Dr. Chan. I mean, it's just, the compassion is just off the charts. So keeping with that theme, I think that a good Wall Street panel and the compassion that we have is exactly what we need to do right now. Wouldn't you agree, Henry?
That is not funny.
Anyway, I want to thank, obviously, President and Mrs. Bush very much for having us here today. So we're going to talk about a couple different things and talk a little bit about the economy. And it affects everything, I think, from top to bottom, what everybody else is speaking about here at the Bush Institute, because the economy has an effect on everything. So no different than 501c3s and things of that nature. So let's just go ahead and get started. So let's talk about the global economy, and how would you sum it up? And I'm going to ask this of all three, and I'll start with Mr. Chairman, and then I can't call him Mr. Secretary, so I have to call him Hank, so I'll call him Hank, and then I'll talk with Eddie, and let's talk about the global economy, and do you think it's on a sustainable trajectory from here, the global economy?
We're in a good phase. We have the most synchronized growth going on right now that we've seen since the financial crisis. The United States is in a strong phase. We're 9 years almost into this recovery. Europe has picked up. Japan has picked up. China had a good first quarter. It's been pretty steady. Emerging markets. So we have, you know, until now there's been a kind of a, you know, some on, some off kind of phenomenon, but now it's been more synchronized. Over the longer term, there's some great questions I'm sure we'll be talking about, you know, whether trade and globalization can be sustained and further integration. What about technical change? Tremendous changes are going to have a big social impact as well. Demographics are an issue, and not only in the United States and Europe, but even in emerging markets, China. You know, it's going to take some new innovations, some further trade and development, some new processes and products to keep the economies growing. But right now, the global economy is in a pretty good state.
Hank?
Well, I don't want to repeat what Ben said. I think he nailed it. He got it right. I think the only thing I would add is I spend a lot of time with business, and when I talk with CEOs of global companies, I've had a number of them say they can't think back over any time over the last 10, 15 years when they've seen anything as attractive as they're looking at right now, because all parts of the world, or most parts, seem to be really firing on all cylinders, and so it's a terrifically positive environment. But the sorts of things I worry about that Ben didn't mention, I think he hit most of them, but the things that I worry about a bit are not just rising protectionism, but higher levels of government debt around the world. And if and when there's a downturn, because there will be a downturn, policymakers aren't going to have as much macroeconomic flexibility in terms of lowering interest rates or fiscal stimulus. And so there's plenty of potential challenges, but right now it looks pretty darn good.
Eddie, how about your take on the global economy and the sustainability of it?
Well, I certainly agree that we're in a good place right now. The one thing I would say is that what we're looking at right now is not what we'll see in the future, that there will definitely be change. So if we think about the economies right now in the world that are growing most rapidly, obviously China continues to grow even though its growth rate has fallen off from where it was at the peak. India is still growing at a high rate. But those economies, which of course represent the largest populations in the world, will slow down. At the same time, other economies are going to pick up. So, for example, if we look at parts of the world that we think of as not having grown very rapidly in the past, like Africa, are now seeing pretty significant growth. So, for example, you take countries like Tanzania, Ethiopia, they have growth rates of around 10%. So we're going to be looking at a world that looks quite different even 1 or 2 decades out from now from the one that we see today. The one thing, Hank issued some cautions, and I'll issue some as well. One of the things we know, at least from people who have studied growth and looked at what are the components that feed into higher growth rates around the world, tend to be a number of factors, 3 of which that are most important are education, have to have high levels of education and increasing levels of education. Rule of law and individual freedom would be the second. And then the third would be having an open economy, and in particular an interest and attention to markets in general. Those are essentially political issues in terms of whether we can count on those things being sustained in the future. President Bush always said I wasn't allowed to talk about politics, so I'm not going to give you a prediction on that. But I think those are the factors that we need to be thinking about for the future.
Wonderful. You know, Hank, you talked a moment ago about protectionism, so that will kind of lead me into the topic here. We see a lot of nationalism and populism manifesting, you know, in different ways around the world, whether it's the Brexit situation, whether it's elections, you know, United States or abroad. There seems to be a very populist viewpoint that are coming out of a lot of the different elections and decisions being made. Do these developments pose serious threats to the global economy? And I'll ask this, and maybe also of you, Mr. Chairman.
Well, Terry, of course they do. And as I look at it, if I look at it more broadly, I see the global economy, the world changing faster than our ability to govern it. And then when I look at individual economies, I think the modern, you know, economies pose challenges that our policies aren't really responding to. And so the key is how do you develop policies that work in today's modern world? And this is ultimately a political decision. So it's a decision that authoritarian governments are dealing with, China and so on. Their present policies aren't going to really work in the future. They're going to need to keep changing them. And of course, our Western democracies have these problems. So we have big groups of people that feel disaffected by the pace of change. They've been left behind. And so we have, you know, this is where populism comes from, nativism, nationalism. And so the challenge really is a political challenge. It's a chicken or an egg. The political situation is created by, you know, unhappy, disaffected people. And then, of course, that creates a political systems that make it hard to respond with the right policy response. So it's in many ways political issues are economic issues and vice versa. And so those are the enemies, and I think that's one of the biggest risks, particularly we face in the West.
Mr. Chairman.
So the integration of the global economy, the expansion of trade, expansion of human movement, immigration is not going to be reversed. This is pretty much here to stay, but on the margin, it can be affected, with political resistance and populist and nativist policies. So, and that in turn can be costly, and, it can slow growth, it can disrupt markets. We've seen how markets have responded to some of the discussions of trade wars, for example. So I agree with Hank, which I think the premise is that if you want people to accept change, if you want people to accept, the tremendous dynamism that a global economy has, you got to help them adapt to change. You got to make it a little bit less scary. And I think there is a case for helping people adapt, whether it's through allowing them to get their skills that they need, or helping them to move from one area to another where the jobs are. I think from a self-preservation perspective, if you want to preserve the dynamism of the global economy, you got to make people able and willing to accept that dynamism.
Right. Andy, let me follow up with you just a little bit on that. Do you think that education and training would help as it relates to some of these populist trends that we're seeing?
Well, I'm always in favor of education and training, since that's what I sell.
Right.
But going back to the points that were made by Ben and Hank, I think those are right on. And there's no doubt that education and training helps, but education and training, remember, is a long-run kind of investment. It's not a short-run investment. And the reason for that is that if you start, even if we were to reform all of our schools along the lines of what Dr. Chan was talking about in the last session, and we were tremendously successful, you're still talking about that happening a generation later, because it takes time for that to move its way into the economy. So one thing that we can be thinking about, though, and I know this sounds counter to some of the current rhetoric, is that we can start bringing more people in who have the skills and education and the kinds of training that we need. One of the things that shows up in the research on immigration and entrepreneurship is that immigrants tend to be very entrepreneurial. We know that, for example, that they're almost twice as entrepreneurial as the native-born population. So there are things that we can do that will at least facilitate some of these transitions in the short run. Again, those are political kinds of considerations, and it's easier said than done, but there's certainly things we should be thinking about.
I would add that some of the things you can do have maybe a better short-run payoff if they help with transitions. If you help retrain, help people move, if you have apprenticeships, technical training of various kinds. I mean, there are some patches you can do, but clearly you want to try to address the long-run issues of appropriate skills for the workforce and so on.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Wonderful. Hank, you talked earlier about China. You mentioned it. You didn't really talk about it, but let's talk a little bit about China. You initiated the U.S.-China Strategic Economic Dialogue. That was an early effort by the U.S. to persuade Chinese government to reduce their role in the Chinese economy and more fully embrace global markets. So a couple questions. How do you think that's going, for starters? And then I'm going to follow up with two more.
Well, how do you think the dialogue is going, or China's going?
Yeah, both.
So I'm going to make one point that I think most people in this room understand, but that when we look at this century, that I believe more than anything else, how the U.S. figures out to deal with a rising China, and how China and the U.S. deal with each other, is going to be the factor that more than anything else shapes the geopolitical landscape we have in the 21st century. And when we deal with China, we have to remember we're not dealing today with the same China we dealt with, even 4 or 5 years ago. We're dealing with a China that is much more assertive. We're dealing with a China that is in many ways a strategic competitor. It's an economic competitor. We don't have to shy away from admitting that or saying that. It's a China that's got the capacity and the reach to advance its own interests in longstanding spheres of United States influence. So that is the perspective in which we need to look at China. And I think the most important thing that we need to do is to not be afraid of competition, to recognize that despite the competition, China and the U.S. have many shared interests. We're not going to solve the major global problems we have, and everything from nuclear proliferation to climate change to, we could go on, and unless we find common ground with China. So we need to figure out how to find common ground at the same time we compete. That's number one. Number two, I think we need to work with our allies. You know, I'll talk about something that's near and dear to my heart, which is China opening up economically. These current tensions come from the fact that for the last 10 years, China has been very slow to open up. And so they haven't provided a level playing field for U.S. companies to compete. And it's not right, and it's creating a lot of problems. We will be much more successful in our efforts if we worked with our allies. We worked with our allies in Japan and Europe and around the world. If we had an assertive agenda in Asia. If we were joined the TPP. Now, we've missed that opportunity, but we still can join the TPP, so we'd have a positive agenda in Asia. I think the third thing I would say is the onus is on us, I think, to raise our own game, to fix our economic problems at home, to be strong economically, militarily, and diplomatically, because I think the Chinese, like any other people, respect strength. So, again, the thing that makes me most uncomfortable is, you know, so many people today, as they look at China, what they see is they see an entrenched Communist Party, they see a more statist economic system, they see a more assertive China. They don't like it. I don't like it as an American, but it exists, and we need to figure out how to deal with it. And so many people have gone from saying, gee, you know, that China is not moving to become a democracy like us. You know, I never expected them to become a liberal democracy at home, or, you know, or Western liberals abroad, but we certainly don't need to view them as an enemy, because we can't afford another Cold War.
You know, I'm going to go a little bit off script because, you know, I have a little experience of investing over there, and it seems like a lot of American companies have invested through China throughout the years, and we all have to, because they dangle a population carrot that, you know, makes people's teeth rattle, and you have to pay attention to it. But at the same time, I don't know anybody that's been very successful there throughout recent history economically as a U.S. company.
Well, I would disagree with you there, because there are many global...
We lost money.
Many global companies that are making a lot of money in China. They're making a lot of money in China. So, but you're right in saying we haven't seen the structural reforms we need to level the playing field. So it's become harder to do business there rather than easier to do business in China. And that is what the world is crying for. You're starting to hear about reciprocity from Europe and the U.S. And I think the biggest risk I see, Terry, is this, that Europeans, people, you know, obviously Americans, are going to say, why should we keep our markets open for China and for Chinese companies if they're not going to open their markets for us? And where that would lead us would be leading us to have big parts of the global economy closed, you know, cut off from trade and investment, which would be a bad thing for both of our countries. And so, again, that is a risk I see. I think it's very, very important we push China to open its markets.
Do you see them becoming more responsible as a global power?
Well,
economic power?
I just want to also say, but we cannot lose sight of the fact that the economic relationship between the U.S. and China positively benefits us in America even today. Yeah. You know, people in their wallets, in their homes, in their businesses. I could go through many ways, but do I see them becoming what? What was your question?
If they become more globally responsible economically to the rest of us. So becoming more responsible in the economic global marketplace.
Listen, I think the proof is going to be in the pudding, okay? So you have a leader right now in Xi Jinping who's consolidated great power. He's got his team in place, and he's got a very strong economic team. So the positive is a potential that he now has the power to get things done and pursue reforms that are in all of our interests. But so we're going to see right now whether they open up. In China, the reformers, the pseudo-reformers, want to open up to private sector companies in China to compete with the state-owned enterprises. The real reformers want to open up to foreign competition. And I think we're going to learn a lot over the next couple of years. But it's going to be easier. The reformers can get the job done easier if they're pushed to get the job done. And that's much more effective done on a multilateral basis than on a bilateral basis.
Thank you. Let me go back to a little bit more U.S.-centric question on the economy, and Eddie, I'll address this to you and to the Secretary. Then, Mr. Chairman, I got to follow up about how we look at different things. But when we talk about the global economy, you gave some earlier comments, but when you look at the U.S. economy, just as a standalone economy, everything's so intertwined today globally. You heard what the Secretary just said about China, and I think somewhat we are absolutely still intertwined with them as well. So is our economy going to be sustainable at these levels? We're looking at record high equities, we're looking at record low rates, and is there something that's going to give here that's going to hurt us?
Yeah, I guess I would focus on a couple of points there. First of all, right now we're in a productivity slowdown. That's a major problem, and it's something that has to be reversed. The question as to why we're in a productivity slowdown, I think we haven't quite answered yet, but I would certainly point to some of the things that we've already talked about. One would be human capital, improvements there, and essentially more market-based policies. We have, over the past, I'd say, decade, moved away from market-based policies. I think that the world has shown us that those are the most successful for growing the economy. I want to come back to one of the things that Hank said, though, which is at the very beginning, he said, you know, one of the things that we have to worry about at the world level is the debt. And I think there's no doubt that if I were going to focus on the big policy issue that's going to face us over the next 20 years, it definitely has to be the debt. And the reason, and I'm talking about the United States right now, and the reason is this. If you look at CBO, Congressional Budget Office's numbers, and you project out even 2 decades, what you're talking about is running a deficit of about 10% per year. So in order to close that gap, we would have to increase taxes across the board, not just taxes on the rich, this is across the board, by about 50%. If we were to increase taxes by 50%, that would have absolutely devastating effects on economic growth and on activity. So those are the problems. Now, there are some good things that we have going for us, and let me end on a somewhat more optimistic note. The United States has outgrown our G7 neighbors for a long period of time, and we've done so primarily for 3 reasons. The first is that we work hard. So if you look at the average hours of work among Americans versus our G7 friends and competitors, we work, for example, 1,100 hours per person in the working age population. In Italy, it's less than 800 hours, and that's true across the board. We're at the top. This second thing we do is we actually have low taxes, despite the fact that we all think our taxes are too high. They are really quite low relative to the rest of the developed economies. Again, if you looked at France, it's 45%. For us, it's about 25% of the economy. And then the third, and this is an important one, is that we do a very good job of integrating our immigrants. And while that, again, sounds kind of backwards given the current rhetoric, one of the ways to see that is if you look at the unemployment rates among immigrants versus unemployment rates among the native-born population. In every G7 country except for the United States, the unemployment rates are higher for immigrants than it is among the native-born population. So, for example, in Germany, it's almost double. In the U.S., immigrants actually have lower unemployment rates than the native-born population. So obviously that's not the only measure of integration, but it does give you an indication that our immigrants are here to work and they're actually successful at getting jobs.
Thank you. Hank, you want to add to that at all? About the U.S. economy?
I've got nothing to add. It was, I thought, very good.
It's the beauty of being up here with all these smart guys.
No, I guess I will add one thing.
Yes, sir.
Despite all that, I would say this. I don't think our democracy is going to work. I don't think our political system is going to work unless we figure out how to have growth be more inclusive. And we can't leave so many people behind. We have still big numbers of working age people not working. Given the opioid problem, given high levels of incarceration, and given income disparity, I don't think that we are going to be able to continue to grow, fix our political system unless we figure out how to deal with that. So again, to me, that is part and parcel with the debt. As Ed said, you know, we're going to have to deal with the debt. And I'd be a little bit more optimistic. I think the debt is a huge problem, but I don't think we need to fix it just with taxes. I think you can use, you know, things like means testing and other things to deal with some of our biggest problems in terms of health care and Social Security.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, we'll get into our world a little bit more here, talk about markets for a second. And you look at all the recent volatility, which is something that I deal with each and every day, but the fluctuations we're seeing in the global markets today. What do you see this path continuing on the volatility because of maybe what I outlined earlier, which are low rates, high valuations on stocks and things of that nature?
So Hank and I and Eddie remember 2008. We're not impressed by the amount of volatility that you're getting here. It actually is not much different from normal right now. It's where we are in terms of volatility. So equity markets and other asset prices have gone up quite a bit. There's basically, to make a list, 3 reasons for that. One is that earnings have been very strong. The economy's been growing for a long time. Earnings have been very solid. Capital's income share has been rising. Tax rates have been cut. All that is generating more profits for firms, and that's positive for equities. Second reason is that interest rates are low, and that's not just a Fed thing. That's really seems to be a long-term issue. The 30-year bond yield right now is 3%. The markets think that low interest rates are here for a long time, and we can debate why that's so. But with very low interest rates, that means that future dividends, future profits get discounted at a lower rate, and that gives you a higher present value. So that's the second reason, and unless that changes radically, that's going to continue to be a support for asset prices. And the third one is risk premiums. So risk premiums are relatively low. They're not crazy low, but they're historically on the low side, meaning that for the last few years, people have been increasingly willing to take risk and to press for yield in this environment. And indeed, in 2017, when these risk premiums were exceptionally low, it was kind of puzzling because it seemed that despite the fact we do have a very uncertain world, we have a lot of uncertainties about our political situation, it seemed that markets were kind of complacent about that. And what we've seen in the last few months is more, I think, acknowledgement that there's uncertainty about where this recovery is going, uncertainty about international trade, uncertainty about geopolitical issues. We've seen concerns about, North Korea and Iran, et cetera. And so it's not all that surprising to see a little more volatility, a little bit more caution on the part of investors. I think that's what we've seen. Although really, as I say, it's quite moderate. Hank and I are just, we're totally blasé about the level of volatility we've been seeing the last few months.
Well, let's talk a little bit about what, you talked about valuations and asset prices, which it's hard to refute that because that's just a fact the way it is, the market's trading right now. But let's just say that doesn't happen. Are you confident, or you're not in a position anymore, that the Fed has the tools and the resources it needs to respond to future downturns in the market? And how do you look at that with your the people that succeeded you today?
So the Fed. So what are you talking about? The Fed is not in the business of propping up stock prices or targeting stock prices. Yep. The Fed is in the business of trying to maintain a stable economy, and that means, in the first instance, trying to make sure the financial system broadly remains stable, which is, of course, what we tried to do in the response to the crisis of 2008. But under more normal circumstances, that means trying to keep unemployment and inflation close to the Fed's targets. And right now, those things are about as close to target as they've been in many, many years. The inflation rate is about 2%, which is the Fed's inflation target, and unemployment is about 4%, which is about as low as it's been for some time. So for the moment, the Fed is very much on target. Now, a concern, which Hank already alluded to, is what happens the next time there's an economic downturn. So forget stocks. Suppose there's an economic downturn for whatever reason. I think there is a bit of concern there. Because the debt and deficit are high, the flexibility of fiscal policy to respond to a downturn is less than it would otherwise be. That puts a lot of burden on the Fed to respond. But the Fed is also in a world where even when interest rates are close to their neutral, non-stimulative level, they're quite low historically. The Fed thinks that the federal funds rate, the short-term interest rate, will be around 3% once things are back to sort of a normal balanced situation. And that doesn't give the Fed much room to cut if the next time there's a slowdown. So that is an issue. Now, the Fed does have other tools. It can use what's called forward guidance. It can essentially make promises that will keep rates low for a long time. It used asset purchases, properly known as quantitative easing, pretty successfully in the last few years. Seems to be unwinding now without too much difficulty. So there are some additional tools. And moreover, the Fed can look at other strategies like changing the way it targets inflation, for example, that could have some impact on its ability to respond to a slowdown. But I think that is an issue. I think it is an issue, and it's not clear that if we had a deep recession, that monetary and fiscal policy would be as effective in responding as might have been the case in the past.
So that brings me to just another question. As a guy who runs a public company, one thing that investors can't stand is when you give guidance and you miss it. They will punish you very badly. And it appears that the Fed gave a lot of guidance throughout the years and maybe didn't follow through with it. And one thing the market hates is uncertainty. And it hates uncertainty when the government gives guidance and the government doesn't follow through with it. What do you say to people that when you're trying to give some comfort, you're almost giving guidance, but then you don't follow through with it? And whether it was keeping rates at historic lows because you could, but you gave guidance if we got unemployment down to a certain number that we'd probably look to tighten rates, things of that nature, but it didn't happen. The market kind of seemed like it was getting a little frustrated with the Fed to some extent.
No, I don't agree with any of that. So to begin with,
I wouldn't expect it to.
To begin with, so there's two kinds of guidance. Okay, this is way more technical. There's two kinds of guidance. One of them is just basically saying, here's what we think is going to happen, best guess. All right, a forecast. And when you make a forecast, I mean, this is not like S&P 500 firms where they know what the profit's going to be and they can maneuver it around. We're talking about real forecast of the economy.
We don't.
When the Fed makes a forecast, it says this is what we think is going to happen. But of course, a forecast is a forecast. It could be wrong. So everybody understands that. And sometimes the market disagrees and we don't agree with you. We think it's going to be something else. That's the first thing. That's what happens. The other thing, though, that can happen, which we saw in the last few years, was the Fed can sometimes say, we promise to do this. Promise, not forecast. And we did that, for example, when we said we would not raise interest rates at least until unemployment got down to 6.5%, for example. We would not raise interest rates at least until we got to the year 2014. And when the Fed made promises like that, it has never failed. It has always met the promises. So again, you have to distinguish between a forecast, which says this is our best guess, but who knows, versus this is what we promised to do. And only rarely does the Fed make an unconditional promise. When it does, it's always followed through.
And that's an interesting point, because I think that's one of the reasons why the Fed minutes are so scrutinized, because every word means potentially something different. And, yourself, it's sitting in that job, was very difficult for you to do.
Yeah, so the Fed used to be, 25 years ago, the Fed wouldn't even tell people when they changed interest rates. So they were totally opaque and totally, mysterious. So now the Fed is much more open. Of course, that sometimes means that, they make, forecasts don't come true. Hank's getting ready to respond to this, but
I want to defend you better than you can, because I want to say, I want to say something. It's harder for you to say, because this country from the third quarter of 2009 grew and started growing at better than 2% while we delevered. And the courage it took, and the really unusual, extraordinary macroeconomic policy is, just look at where the United States of America is. So I couldn't agree more with Ben in saying I think the Fed said they were going to do something. A lot of people criticized them and said there's all these risks. You know, you shouldn't be doing this extraordinary monetary policy. Look at the risk. And now look at where we are. And let me tell you, he was right. And so I just think that this is he did a superb, and the Fed did a superb job of saying they were going to do something, doing what they said they were going to do, and being right.
I don't think I'm getting invited back next year, Ken.
Thank you, Hay.
We doing okay? Whew. These guys are getting mad at me. I'm glad they're out of office. You're regulating me right now.
Yeah.
Throwing a hammer at me. Anyway, I told you I get a rise out of them.
Yeah.
Mr. Secretary, since you told me to call you Hank, you were the first to call attention to the increasing gap between the richest and the poorest in the United States. How do you believe that gap has contributed to the state of partisan politics, if at all?
Yeah, I think, Terry, I think this group is probably answered that. I even when I was still at Goldman Sachs in 2006, I was fascinated and disturbed by income disparity, not just in the U.S., but all over the world. And I really do believe that for our political system to work, longer term, there has to be, it's difficult to work with that level of disparity. So obviously, it's a significant issue. It's one that predated the financial crisis. There are all kinds of structural issues that were causing it. I think automation and technology, are having a major impact. And I'm not going to argue against that. And technology is doing a wonderful job of helping a lot of people, rise out of poverty. It's got great potential. But I firmly believe in the United States of America right now, it's killing more jobs than it's creating. And automation is really putting pressure, on wages. And I think this poses a huge challenge. And I would just want to say one other thing and give a call out, because I actually, wish I'd said at the beginning how honored and privileged I was to work for President Bush. He was the best boss I ever had. To me, Ben mentioned the financial crisis, the leadership and the support he showed, particularly then, is something I'm really grateful for. And one of the things I was very grateful for when I came to Treasury, he encouraged me to build relationships with Democrats and Republicans, and to really take a bipartisan approach. And he was very supportive. And I remember when I made that speech and talked about income disparity, there were a few people, in the White House staff that didn't like it, and the president loved it, and he understood the real problem that exists there.
One of my favorite lines is from my dear friend Speaker Boehner, and I know he's here somewhere, but he said as Speaker, he said, and as a leader, he said, there was never a president that did not get up every morning with the intention only to do what's in the best interest of the American people. And to me, that's saying a lot. And that's the way it should be. And I would hope that our current administration would take a little closer look at the way President Bush conducted himself for the American people. Ed, again, off script, here I go, sorry, Ken. Ed, real quick, you've done a lot of work with the labor market and workforce development. What are your thoughts on the idea of the skills gap and leaving some workers behind? And I'll have a follow-up on that, but you could just talk a little bit about the skills gap.
That's quite closely related to the discussion that you're just having about income inequality. One of the things that we know is that if we look at the earnings distribution in the United States, and if we look at the educational system as it relates to the earnings distribution, one of the things that we see is that education here does pretty well for the top third of our earners. It does reasonably well for the next sixth. But actually the bottom half, we're not talking about the poor. So when we think of income inequality, what we're usually thinking about is something like, lowest 20% or lowest 30%. But it's actually, in the United States, it's actually been just the bottom half that hasn't done very well. And the question is why? And I would say, well, maybe we don't have it quite right in terms of our training. One of the things that President Bush pushed when we were all in the government was a better system for vocational training, perhaps through the community colleges. And there's some evidence that there might be some payoff to that. If you compare, for example, the United States to Germany, one of the things you find is that our high school graduates earn about 70% of the average wage in the population, whereas in Germany, the vocational graduates earn about 90%. So we know that those systems, while they're not right for everybody, seem to do a lot better for certain parts of our population. I know, again, Dr. Chan was talking about schools in East Palo Alto. Where I live in Silicon Valley and near Stanford, we have schools that are essentially bifurcated, where you have half the kids who are on the academic track and then the other half who are not. And those kids who are not on the academic track are getting something that's essentially watered down academics. So instead of taking these AP courses that she was talking about, getting calculus when you're in your second year of high school, they're hoping to get these kids to algebra by their final year of high school. But most of those skills are not going to be useful to them when they're in the labor force. And unfortunately, we haven't focused enough, I think, on training people to do something that's actually productive when they're in the labor force. And by the way, most of the jobs that we're talking about, even in the German system, are service jobs. We're not talking about manufacturing or construction. We're actually talking about just being more productive in service jobs in the kind of economy that we have.
Well, I know our time is getting short here. They told me I had 45 minutes. I told them it takes me that long to clear my throat. I stole that line from Chris Dodd. Anyway, I have a final question for you, and all of you can comment on this. You know, I want to get your thoughts on where we go from here. I speak to a lot of students at university. It's one of the things I really enjoy doing in a very relaxed atmosphere, talk to kids, talk about real life examples. I grew up on the streets, so I feel like I have the credibility to do this. I have twin teenage boys, so I'm 59, my kids are 15. Math doesn't work very well, so we can see how that's going. Married 26 years though, same woman. As everyone knows, children are our future. And it appears that they'll be inheriting a lot of different issues from our generations and others. I'm curious on what your thoughts are for the next generation of leaders and kids today. And when you talk, and Ed, I'll start with you, and then maybe Mr. Secretary and Mr. Chairman, you can wrap it up.
Well, I'm very optimistic. I view it as a real privilege to teach at Stanford. The students that I have are just unbelievably talented people. And it was true when I taught at University of Chicago, and of course, you know, these are elite schools. But I'm not quite as pessimistic about the young generation. I think. While there may be something wrong with kids today, there may be something wrong with us as well in terms of the way we treat them. So, I guess I would still push opportunities. I think that one of the things that we see is that our students are moving in directions where the opportunities are available, and as long as we create an environment such that those opportunities are going to continue to exist, we'll have the students doing the right thing. That said, I would issue one caution, and I do think that we've become a little bit more closed-minded in academia than we were in the past, and that's probably not the students. Students are always think that they have the truth. You know, you look at the three of us, we're all bald, which means that we went to school during the Vietnam War times, and there was no. You're a little younger, Ben. Sorry, but.
Hey, listen, don't get them
Hank and I are together.
Class of 68.
Yeah, I mean, there was no more tumultuous time than that. But the difference was that while we thought we knew everything, there were people who pushed back. And that was true among the faculty, among the media, and among the intelligentsia. And I think right now, the one thing that I would say we have to worry about is that those other three groups are not pushing back perhaps as hard as they should.
Thank you. Mr. Secretary, then Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think if we're optimistic, it's really got to come from the young people, because all the issues we talked about today were about whether it's the national debt or whether it's our political system or some of the issues we didn't talk about, like climate change and environmental risk. These are generational equity, and the thing that concerns me the most about our country is it's older people that are involved in the political system, and they're being very selfish because we're not investing in the young. If you run a company, what you do is you're always looking for young talent, and you're investing in young people. We as a nation are underinvesting in our young people. And I'm really, really impressed by the young people I see, but, on the campuses. But if I had a caution, it'd be the same one Ed raised, because I'll say it a little bit blunter. I think I see so much political correctness, so much talking about people, safe spaces, worrying about hurting someone's feeling. And I also see a lack of patriotism, because it really, if we're going to meet the challenges we need to make, it's going to take, I think, a greater sense of patriotism from young people. But again, the energy, the ability you see from young people is tremendous, and that's really our future.
Mr. Chairman.
Well, I think there's an awful lot of noise which comes from the political system, and all that's very important, but there's an awful lot going on underneath, this is a very strong country, a very diverse country. An example, what's happened in this is Texas, so what's happened in energy, right? I mean, we were, 40 years ago, we were worried about running out of oil. now, of course, North America is pretty much self-sufficient. So there is a lot of ability to adapt, there's a lot of ability to make progress. I do think that there is a challenge, which is putting aside all these social issues, which are very important. I think that the progress on artificial intelligence, which could make huge changes in our economy very quickly at some point, was going to be very challenging to our political and social structure, because some people are probably going to find themselves redundant in a traditional economic sense. How are they going to adapt? Others are going to have tremendous opportunities based on these new technologies. So I think that technology, which is just beginning really to become relevant to, to the economy, is going to create some very big social and economic challenges in the next 25 years.
I want to take this opportunity. We ran about 3 or 5 minutes long here, Ken, so I know that I have to write a check now to the Bush Institute for being penalized for the length of time, so that's my fault, but got an old match over here. Anyway, how about a nice round of applause for Ben, Hank, and Eddie.
Thank you, gentlemen, for a phenomenal conversation and for your service. The country we're all...
Welcome back to the live desk at the George W. Bush Presidential Center's Forum on Leadership. I'm your host, Kevin Sullivan. We spent the last couple of hours tuning into panels on education reform with Priscilla Chan, on nationalism and global markets with Hank Paulson, Ben Bernanke, and Ed Lazier. If you missed them, we'll post the video momentarily at bushcenter.org. I had a conversation earlier today with Secretary Paulson. Let's go to that interview now. Now we're privileged to welcome to the live desk Secretary Hank Paulson, former Secretary of the Treasury, of course. Thank you so much for joining us today,
Sully,
Secretary Paulson.
it's terrific to be here.
Tell us, first of all, about your work at the Paulson Institute.
Well, when I left the Bush administration, I wanted to do what most people do, make a difference, do something that played to my skill set and my interests. I felt that the U.S.-China relationship, a bilateral relationship, is going to be the most consequential one of this century. So I set up a institute that was focused on sustainable economic development and growth and environmental protection in both the U.S. and in China. I call it a think and do tank because we have some programs largely focused on climate change, energy efficiency, some conservation programs advising the Chinese government on their national park system and wetlands conservation. In terms of the economic side, we're strong advocates for Chinese investment in the U.S. to create jobs here. Mm-hmm. And we have a think tank that's focused on the most, I think, the most important and fundamental policy issues, economic issues in China. Everything from pension reform, tax reform, reforming state-owned enterprises.
And how are the Chinese responding to your outreach in these areas?
Very, very favorably. Part of the reason that I decided to work there is I've known a good number of the top leaders for a long time, including General Party Secretary Xi Jinping. When President Bush asked me to set up the Strategic Economic Dialogue, I stopped first at Hangzhou and actually met with Xi Jinping before he was anointed as a vice president, before going on and meeting with the president and the premier in Beijing at the time.
Now, you have long been interested in conservation, your family going way back. But why does the green finance matter so much? What's the key there?
Well, green finance is all about saving our planet. It's going to take trillions of dollars to clean up the environmental mess we have and to move to a lower carbon economy. And governments don't have the money, so it's going to take the private sector. I'll use China as an example. They're spending $600 billion to $1 trillion every year for the next 5 years to clean up their environment. The government can provide about 10% of that. So green finance is how do the governments put the programs in place, the policies in place to attract the private capital. And so my institute, and I started working with the Chinese government when they became president of the G20. This was a body that President Bush set up, and we advised them on their green finance working group. And so we've been working closely with them on that, on rolling out their cap and trade system, which will be the largest carbon market in the world. So again, it's very important. And the reason it's so important in China is they're the biggest emitter of carbon, and they're a model for the rest of the developing world. And so again, a very interesting and I think important work.
Now, you have a fascinating background from your time as an Eagle Scout, football player at Dartmouth, President or CEO of Goldman Sachs, Secretary of the Treasury. What leadership attributes have you seen that translate across the board to all sectors?
Well, it's interesting because I've worked with some great leaders like President Bush. I've worked with some that weren't as great leaders. I've worked with some good CEOs in business, and they have different skill sets. They can still be great leaders with different skill sets, but the great ones all have certain things in common. The first thing I would say is they need to surround themselves with terrific people. People that complement their strengths and compensate for their weaknesses. And I think that's very important. The next thing is they're accountable. They run to problems, they don't run away. They identify the problems and they take responsibility and work to solve them. Thirdly, they think outside of the box. I say define the job expansively. They do whatever it takes, break glass, do whatever it takes. Don't take no for an answer if there's something that's really, really important. The next thing is they really show they care about people. You know, President Bush just exuded that, and people will go to great lengths for you if you know the boss cares about you. The last thing is they set a standard in terms of integrity. I'm not just talking about obey the law, but this is about doing the right thing. I don't find it very interesting when people say, why do bad people do bad things? That's why you have jails. Why do good people do good things? That's not very interesting. Why do good people do bad things? That's very, very interesting. And they do it because there's a groupthink environment, and the leader has got to set the environment where if something doesn't feel right, people aren't afraid to bring it up. They're encouraged to bring it up and ask questions.
What you just described was principled leadership in so many ways, and of course that was the hallmark of our experience with President Bush. Now, hearkening back to the financial crisis of 2008, where your leadership was so important and so effective, you had a situation there where you had people with conflicting points of view to your own, and yet you got them to hear you. How did you do that?
Well, it started with President Bush because, unfortunately, I had a year in Washington to build a close working relationship of trust with President Bush before the financial crisis. Otherwise, nothing would have worked, number one. And number two, he encouraged me. He asked me from day one to build relationships on both sides of the aisle. And my experience at Goldman Sachs was that at the same time I was a CEO and running a big organization, I was working with clients, so I knew how to work with principals, how to give advice, not just how to give orders. I knew how to listen. And, I knew that the relationship with President Bush would only work if I had built a relationship of trust with him. So that's how I treated members of Congress. And the president put me in a position where I had good opportunity to work with Democrats and Republicans a year before the financial crisis hit. So I'd been able to work with the Democrats like Nancy Pelosi and Barney Frank, and it's just like the Republicans like John Boehner and Mitch McConnell on things like free trade agreements, on the stimulus plan. So again, it starts at the top, and I have very little respect for anybody that says it's my way or the highway. Right. The only way you get things done is by compromise and doing it on a bipartisan basis.
Well, you laid the groundwork in advance to make that happen. It's a privilege to be back with you again, Secretary Paulson. Thanks so much for spending a few minutes here at the live desk.
Thank you.
That was former Secretary of the Treasury Hank Paulson. He participated on a panel earlier today about nationalism and global markets with Ben Bernanke, Ed Lazier, and Terry Duffy. If you missed it, check it out at bushcenter.org. Stay tuned now for Studio 43. Today's theme is Transformations in Foundations, New Perspectives for Changing Times. We'll kick it off at 5 with a panel on conservation with Mrs. Laura Bush, who of course is deeply passionate about conservation. And then we'll have the Bush Center's landscape architect, Michael Van Valkenburg, with us, along with interior designer James Farmer and SMU economics professor Klaus Desmond, to discuss why conservation matters in our cities and our own backyards. Don't forget, follow the conversation on social media and join the conversation by sharing photos with hashtag #MyChargeToKeep on both Twitter and Instagram. See you back here live at 8:50 tomorrow morning. Enjoy the show. Here with us now from Perry, Georgia, is author and interior designer James Farmer. James will be joining us live on our conservation panel today at 5 p.m. Central. He's also editor-at-large for Southern Living. This is going to be fun. This is one of the more interesting guys you're going to run into. Thanks for stopping by the live desk, James.
Sully, thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
So tell us, first of all, about your business.
Well, I'm an interior designer, so I have a great staff and team that works with me, and we're a full-service design firm. We help you whether you're building your home or furnishing your living room. To me, interior design is a service opportunity where we're able to provide you with a lifestyle and a home, creating a house into a home, making it comfortable and stylish.
Now, your business is thriving. How did you find time to write 8 books along the way?
Well, I'm passionate about what I do. I love design. I think design and I think food and gardening and style are all related. And writing to me is an outlet. So whether it's social media or blogs, and the next thing you know, magazine articles, it led to some book ideas that I'd really carried since college. And so the time is, you make the time for what you want to do, and I wanted to write books.
And from a leadership standpoint, you're running a business. So what is since it is the forum on leadership, what's your leadership philosophy?
Well, my belief and philosophy on leadership is a true leader is first off a servant, and how that servant best serves his or her team, their staff. So I don't like to micromanage, but what I like to do is manage on a micro level. What does my team need individually?
Right.
Corporately as a whole, we are a machine, but this person and this person all have different needs and different personalities, and what I need to do to accomplish that is really how I like to serve, and by serving, that's how I want to lead.
So you're big on the concept of garden living.
Yes.
You're an interior designer, but you talk about food and the outdoors and everything else. So explain that concept to us.
Well, garden living to me, from the interior design standpoint, but let alone from life, is really how I like to live. In interiors, you think about, there's flowers in fabric or there's flowers on the table. But for me, how a garden really influences our life each and every day is simple. It could be a tomato that you've grown yourself and you've made a tomato sandwich, and that's your life. Your life has been enriched and sustained by what you've grown. It could be the flowers on the table. My grandmother really summed it up best when she said we eat with our eyes first. And so you bring the garden inside, and living with that garden, a sprig of mint in your tea, sandwich or vegetables, whatever it is, that's garden living, where each and every day is enriched by the land.
And what's what's in your garden at home? What do you like to plant?
So I really am a lazy gardener. I like to plant what works. So rather than having something that has to be pruned all the time or needs lots of care, I stick with great southern basics. I love boxwoods simply because they don't need to be shaped all the time. I love crepe myrtles as great trees, but I plant a lot of flowers to cut. I love to set a beautiful table. And so right now I just planted all my zinnias and cosmos and amaranthus and lots of hydrangeas. They're my favorite.
So some good free advice for our live stream audience today. People normally have to pay big bucks for this kind of stuff. So tell us about your relationship with the Bush family. Jenna Hager Bush wrote the foreword to one of your books.
Yes. So Jenna Bush Hager is a dear friend of mine. We've been assigned some story assignments and became friends. And Barbara and I have become friends as well through other friends. And I asked Jenna, I said, I'd love for you to write the foreword for my cookbook. And she hem-hawed about it. And I said, Jenna, you have a great perspective. I grew up in a White House, and my mother and grandmother cooked and taught me how to entertain. You grew up in the White House with your mother and grandmother cooking and entertaining and a whole different level, but I wanted that perspective because when it comes down to it, it's the food, it's the table, it's that faith and fellowship and family that brings us to the table, and the Bushes represent that, and I just love them for it.
Now you're about to head in for your panel on conservation with Mrs. Bush.
Yes.
Give us a sneak peek of that, a little bit of a preview of what we can expect.
So what I love to do is to educate while entertaining people. So as soon as you sometimes say the word educate, immediately we want to put the snooze on and not think about it. But if you can entertain someone while they're being educated, so it has to be something they're passionate about. And for me, flowers and gardening is something I am very passionate about simply because the conservation part of it all is very important. When you know your zone, when you know your plants, when you know how to plant them, how to take care of them, the work's done for you. Like I mentioned, I'm a lazy gardener. So when you plant things that work, the work's done, and then everyone says, God, Sully, your yard looks great. Well, you let the plants do the work for you. So it's knowing that is that first bit of knowledge, entertainment, that's a key point of conservation.
Now, where are we in the country right now in conservation? Have we made enough progress? Where do we stand?
I think we could always make progress. I don't think we will ever be fully there. I think what we'll be is always turning a corner, and that's exciting. Knowing what to plant, knowing things that don't require too much water if you're in a water restrictive area, knowing what plants provide, resting places for whether it's the monarch butterfly or other endangered species who are traveling. That's really amazing, but it's getting it out there. A lot of people think I have to wait till I retire to start gardening. No, I started when I could walk. You can too.
Give us a sneak peek of the next book in the pipeline, or what can we look forward to?
I'm really looking forward to another book. I don't know exactly what it'll be yet. I'll have to ask Jenna if she wants to help me write it. But what I would love to do is write another book just celebrating the lifestyle, how the garden and how design influence our lives, and we'll see where it goes.
Well, and you told an interesting story of being turned down by several publishers when you first got started. Loyalty is important to you.
Loyalty is very important to me, and I believe in going to the dance with who asked you. And I had a great publisher, Gibb Smith, who took a chance with me, and I've proved it to them that I can write a book, I can sell it, but also I can have an audience who is, pun intended, hungry to learn about food and gardening.
And when those publishers that turned you down initially when you were really a young guy getting started, once you sold a bunch of books, they wanted to...
They did come back, and I just had to tell them that kind of Southern expression. I said, y'all, I'm going to the dance with who asked me, and I don't think they got it completely. They were all from New York, but I think maybe what I could do is just enlighten them on the fact that someone had faith in me, and I had faith in them, and I want to continue that loyalty.
Well, thank you for the time, James.
It's I appreciate it.
At James T. Farmer on Instagram. He's
Absolutely.
a great follow, and thank you again for your time.
Thank you.
Now we have Holly Kuzmich, Executive Director of the Bush Institute. Holly, interesting career, a great asset to us here at the Bush Institute. Worked on Capitol Hill, worked at the White House in domestic policy for President Bush. Has done consulting and now, in addition to being a Senior Vice President of the Bush Center, is the Executive Director of the Bush Institute and does a great job leading that enterprise. Holly, thank you for your time today. Now, big doings here at the Forum on Leadership, and we're unveiling our Leadership in Action report. Why don't you talk? Right. Let's start by talking about the leadership work that's done here and the results that we've gotten.
Well, so when the Bush Institute started, almost 8 years ago now, one of the first programs that was put in place was the Women's Initiative Fellowship. And this was a program that came out of our women's initiative to train women in the Middle East to develop their leadership skills. Since that time, we've now added 2 more leadership programs to that roster. One for young leaders in Burma that came out of our work on human freedom and democracy, and then our Presidential Leadership Scholars Program. And I think the thing we noticed, the more programs we created and the more we really looked at how we structured them, the curriculum we used, the unique assets within the programs, we realized that, number one, we were having an effect, and number two, we do have something unique to bring to bear when we look at all of the other leadership programs that are out there. And so that was obviously something we wanted to make sure happened here, and that's what led to this report, which outlines the first several years of our results of these programs.
Yeah, the results are really pretty astounding, and especially when you compare them to the private sector programs like this. I mean, we really are able to have enormous influence because we're at a presidential center.
We think so, and that's what our results show. We went out and surveyed the over 300 graduates of the programs that we've had to date and asked them, how likely are you to strongly recommend this program to a friend or colleague? It's what results in something called the Net Promoter Score. And we received a score of 89. It's a scale from negative 100 all the way up to 100. Most people are thrilled to get anything above 50. And so to get 89 is something pretty extraordinary, because it's not only how much do you recommend it, it's how much do you strongly recommend it. And so this is something that our graduates feel like has really transformed their work and their lives.
And we hear that from the participants, that their lives are changing. Mm-hmm. Is there a brand of leadership that is developed at the Bush Center?
Well, I think that the brand of leadership that we develop is really about values and principles, and that's true whether we're training young leaders in Burma, where we have more of a focus on freedom and free markets. That's not necessarily what we do in Presidential Leadership Scholars, but there is a common theme, and it's all about understanding your values, your motivation as a leader, bringing that into your work every day, thinking about how you communicate your vision, how you influence and persuade others, what kind of partnerships you build. That, no matter what kind of program we run, is woven into all of it, and that is sort of what we call our special sauce here at the Bush Institute.
And finally, you worked for President Bush both in the administration and obviously here at the Bush Center. How has he influenced your own personal leadership style?
Well, he's an easy guy to work for because what we teach in our leadership programs is the way that he leads all of us, which is he's very clear on what his principles are. That was true when he was president. It's true in the work that we do here at the Bush Institute. And so when he says, here's what I care about, we know what we're going and executing against. And so that was true when he was president and when I worked on education policy for him in the White House. And it's true here now, and it's why we build in principles-based leadership into the work we do.
Well, congratulations, Holly, on all the success you're having in developing leaders. And for more, go to bushcenter.org/leadership in action. You can find the report there. Lots of good stuff in here. Thanks a lot, Holly Kuzmich.
Thank you.
Now we get to hear from some of our guests I spoke to earlier today, starting with Dr. Priscilla Chan, co-founder of the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Thank you for stopping by the Forum on Leadership Live desk, Dr. Chan.
Thank you so much for having me. It's an honor to be here.
You just finished an interesting conversation with Ann Wicks of the Bush Institute. Give us a recap for our live stream viewers of the themes that may have emerged from your conversation on education.
Yeah, I had the pleasure of spending some time talking to Ann, and we really talked about what do students need to be successful in the modern changing economy. And that really means having a broader definition of success. What should we be doing to make sure that our students are not only knowledgeable, but prepared to continuously learn? And so that range from what it looks like to really be able to offer personalized learning in the classroom, putting the student and teacher relationship at the center of the classroom relationship, and then really taking a broad look at what you need in addition to academics to be successful, ranging from social emotional development, identity, curiosity, grit, physical health. So a broad range of topics.
Now, you stepped away from your medical practice to launch the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative. Tell us about that.
Mark and I launched the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative 2 years ago now. We were expecting our first daughter, Max, and we just had this incredibly common human emotion of, oh my gosh, our daughter is coming. We have to do something to prepare. And for that, it was the realization that we want Max and all the children in her generation to live in a world that is incredible and beyond our wildest dreams. And we realized that we needed to do our part to make that happen. And so we launched the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative to be a philanthropy that engineers change at scale. We work in science, education, and justice and opportunity. We realized that we are tiny in comparison to the scope of the problems that we're trying to tackle. So that means that we have to be really incredibly careful about where we think we are best leveraged to actually have impact. And that means for us taking a step back and thinking, where can Mark and I uniquely contribute? And for me, that's been being a school teacher and as a pediatrician, where that experience about being in the front lines and seeing what the real problems are that children and families face every day that prevent them from being able to be successful in the classroom or to stay healthy. And also building the humility and seeing that those great solutions already exist in the field. And what's missing is the opportunity to share that and scale those great solutions to serve all of those in need. And then I've been lucky enough to be paired with Mark, who's built technology that has improved and changed the lives of many and been able to scale those tools to reach many. And so together we've really seen that collaboration across sectors is really key to us being able to be successful, as well as really staying close to the problems and building for the long term.
Well, how can tech best be used in the classroom?
Technology is best when you enable the teacher to be able to do her job best. And for us, the core of it is really the teacher being able to know what each one of her student needs and being able to set each student up for success. And so it's not every child behind a laptop. That is not anyone's idea of great teaching. What we're really talking about is giving students and teachers tools so that instead of facing a classroom of 30 where a teacher is not able to really meet each one of her child's needs, being able to break that classroom down in a way that a teacher can see what each one of her student needs, be able to meet that need and build that incredible one-on-one mentorship that's so important for a child to be inspired, excited about learning, and to be successful.
These are enormously complex issues that you've taken on at CZI. But what do you think the world, if your dreams came true, what would all of this look like 5 years from now, 10 years from now, when Max is maybe entering high school, let's say?
For me, in being able to build and learn is the key. So in 5 or 10 years from now, we are able to learn what works really well and to do more of that, and to continuously to be adaptive to what the schools, teachers, and children need. And what that means is being able to continue to iterate on what we're doing and understand where we need to go. There's no perfect end state. There is just being able to say, this is what we understand and this is where we need to move forward. And also bringing that broader definition of success. Right now, we know that academics are the table stakes, but we also know that there's so much more that great teachers impart. Really identity, social emotional development, the intellectual curiosity we want each one of our students to have. And we don't know when we don't know what makes a great teacher able to do that. But what we hope to do is be able to better understand and make sure that how to measure progress for each student.
Last question. Print books or e-readers?
Depends on what you're doing. You have to respond to the environment. So on vacations, an e-reader, so I can bring lots of books.
Right.
But then the nerd in me, there's nothing better than cracking open a fresh book.
Right.
And enjoying those pages. So both.
Well, thank you so much. It's really a pleasure to meet you, Dr. Chan. Thanks for coming by.
Thanks for having me.
You bet. Thanks again to Dr. Priscilla Chan for joining us here at the live desk. Stay tuned now for Studio 43, Going Native, Why Conservation Matters in Our Cities and in Our Own Backyards. This is a panel featuring Mrs. Laura Bush and some other interesting experts on conservation. So I hope you enjoy.
Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome the Vice President of Finance and Operations at the George W. Bush Presidential Center, Brian Cossiboom.
Hello and good evening, and welcome to our inaugural Forum on Leadership and our very first Studio 43. As Ken mentioned earlier, these Studio 43 conversations are part of our ongoing Transformation and Foundation series, a discussion of forces that will transform our lives over the next 50 years, and reinforcing those concepts that bind us together as citizens. So to that end, this conversation will check both boxes: nature, which is foundational, and conservation, which is transformational. In a few moments, we'll hear from a distinguished group of experts as they discuss this important and timely topic. Our panel today includes James Farmer, the prolific author of several best-selling garden and interior design books. If you watch television, listen to the radio, or read popular magazines like Southern Living, Traditional Home, or Southern Home, you have likely already been exposed to James's Southern grace and charm. Also on our panel today is world-renowned landscape architect Michael Van Valkenburg. Michael is certainly no stranger to the Bush Center. Many of you likely enjoyed his handiwork as you arrived today. Michael and his team at Michael Van Valkenburg and Associates sculpted the grounds of the Bush Center, which I know you will be hearing a lot more about in a few minutes. Our beautiful grounds sit on an equally lovely campus. So it's very fitting that today's panel will be moderated by SMU's very own Klaus Desmet. Klaus's research focuses on international trade, economic growth, and a topic that will be particularly relevant to today's conversation, urban economics. Many of you may not know that you sit here today in the very first presidential library designed to achieve the U.S. Green Building Council's LEED Platinum designation. This designation would not have been possible without the leadership of the chair of our design committee, Mrs. Laura Bush. Mrs. Bush has been an ardent supporter of conservation for decades. She used her platform as First Lady to visit more than 30 national parks and also served as the honorary co-chair of the National Park Service Centennial. She also practices what she preaches. She's been the visionary behind the wildflower prairie restoration at her Prairie Chapel Ranch outside of Crawford, Texas. It was also very natural then that those efforts transitioned to the Bush Center and the creation of our 15-acre native Texas park. I do hope everyone takes time to enjoy that while you're here today. The wildflowers are in bloom. She's also the founder of Texan by Nature, a nonprofit organization committed to prairie restoration efforts and teaching Texans the importance of conserving our state's natural resources. Before our panelists take the stage, it's my great honor to introduce one of America's most beloved First Ladies, my friend, Mrs. Laura Bush.
Thank you all. Thanks, everybody. Thank you very much. And thanks to Brian. Brian wears many hats around here, and one of those is making sure the Bush Center looks good every day. So thank you, Brian, for taking care of our building and grounds and for making the Bush Center such an attractive destination for our visitors. I like to look out of the windows up in our offices upstairs and see people walking on the trails that are down here with their, I just looked out and I saw a stroller with a baby, and then I see somebody with a dog, and I can see that people are enjoying the grounds. I became a conservationist as a mature little girl growing up in West Texas. I was an only child, and I spent summers with my grandparents in El Paso, watching and helping my Grammy for hours in her garden. If she were alive today, she would be on this panel telling us how to make the most of your backyard spaces, that you too can grow flowers in the center of a stray recycled tire, or keep asparagus, yuccas, ocotillas, and pomegranate trees thriving in the harshest of conditions. In Midland, I learned to love the outdoors from my mother, who, if she weren't reading, could be found outside. Mother was a knowledgeable, self-taught naturalist who remembered the name of nearly every wildflower and was passionate about birds. Her fascination began when I was 10, and she volunteered to be my Girl Scout leader, which involved helping us earn our bird badge. We would sit Indian style with binoculars and wait for birds to swoop down on the prairie mesquite stubble. Each year, thousands of birds flew through Midland, and it was then that I learned that my city sat along a north-south migratory path. Mother became a devoted bird watcher, and as we drove around town together, she would point out the hawks and the painted buntings as they floated by in the sky. The sky in Midland is a flawless dome. The land doesn't pitch or rise, but remains perfectly flat, without buildings or bright lights to obscure the view. For as far back as I can remember, on a particularly spectacular summer night, Mother would gather a blanket, and we would go outside to lie on the ground and gaze up into the sky. And as we laid together up on the hard grass, she would say, "Look up, Laura, look up." And it was then, as a bright-eyed girl, that I began to look up and to look out across vast landscapes and not to miss the beauty around us. Since then, conservation and the protection of our natural world has been a part of my life. I've hiked in a national park with my childhood friends for over the last 30 years. As First Lady, I advocated for the protection of our lands and oceans through the National Park Service and the Marine Debris Initiative. And today I work in conservation through prairie restoration at the Bush Center and at our ranch in Crawford, and through the nonprofit I founded, Texan by Nature. You may not know that the Bush Center sits on a 15-acre native prairie park that celebrates the natural native environment of our home state. George and I worked with Michael Van Bockenberg, who you'll hear from next, to landscape the grounds with the native prairie grasses that once flourished right here in this part of Texas. We planted nearly 930 trees native to Texas, including pecan, Texas redbud, live oak, chica-pin oak, Eve's necklace, and rusty blackhaw viburnum. With the assistance of the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, we developed a mixture of 5 Texas native grasses for our grass lawn. Comprised of buffalo grass, blue grama, Texas grama, curly mesquite, and poverty dropseed, this habiturf is available to plant in your own yard, and you can purchase it at the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center or at Douglas King Growers. The Bush Center grounds feature an amphitheater, a mile-long walking trail, a wildflower meadow, and a 252,000-gallon underground cistern that collects all the storm runoff from our building, even from the parking lot, and repurposes it to irrigate our native Texas park. Efforts to develop parks in the hearts of a city like Dallas are increasingly important, as 80% of our nation's population now resides in urban areas. Exposing more urban dwellers to the natural beauty of our country and helping them understand that we all have a part to play in conservation is critical to maintaining the integrity of our unique natural heritage. I like to look out the window of my office here at the Bush Center and see visitors in the Prairie Park discovering the joys of nature right here in the middle of the city. School children come on field trips and enjoy picnic lunches in the amphitheater. Families come to walk their dogs. Parents bring their children for the Texas tradition of an annual photo shoot in the Bluebonnets. and SMU students enjoy tossing a football on the lawn. But we all know many Americans aren't so fortunate and seldom experience nature in their daily lives due to urbanization and our increasingly sedentary lifestyles. Children today spend half as much time outdoors as children did just 20 years ago, yet they spend nearly 8 hours a day looking at a screen. In fact, children spend less time outside than any children in the history of mankind. This has a significant impact on our state's growing obesity rate. We know that by simply taking the nature cure, we can enrich our lives and improve our health in many ways. Last year, Texan by Nature, in a partnership with Houston Methodist Hospital, hosted a symposium focused on the connection between health and nature. We learned that play in nature contributes to the capacity for creativity, problem solving, and emotional and intellectual development. Scientific research showed that being outside in nature can reduce stress, soothe mental health conditions, and combat obesity, and that the most direct route to caring for the environment as an adult is participation in nature activities before the age of 11. And the benefits of nature aren't just for children. The American Public Health Association tells us that people of all ages and abilities enjoy higher levels of health and well-being when they have nature nearby in parks, gardens, greenways, naturalized schoolyards and playgrounds, and natural landscaping around homes and workplaces. We've only just begun to understand the depth of the connection between health and nature through scientific research. But imagine the impact future findings could have, from how we treat illnesses, to how we plan our cities, to how we live and work each day. So I encourage all of you to take the nature cure. By supporting the development of parks in your hometowns, or by planting a native garden in your own backyard, you can assure a healthier and more beautiful world for our children and grandchildren. Our health, our economy, and our natural heritage depends on it. Now I'd like to invite our panelists to the stage.
Well, thank you so much for joining us this afternoon. As Mrs. Bush so eloquently talked about, our conversation today will be about conservation, and in particular the value of recovering native landscapes. And the way I'm going to organize a little bit our conversation here today is, in the first part, we'll talk about some of the large-scale and the smaller-scale projects that are going on in our cities, and talk about their environmental and ecological value. And then in the second part, I would like to broaden the discussion a little bit and talk about the broader societal and economic benefits of conservation, because I'm convinced that saving our landscapes and introducing these types of environments in urban settings are compatible with sound economic and business principles. So I think it's important to keep that in mind, and so I hope in the second part of the conversation to touch on some of these topics. So I'd like to now maybe start talking with Michael van Valkenburg, who, as you all know, is responsible for the beautiful garden that we have here at the Bush Presidential Center. And so could you maybe reveal some of the secrets about this garden? Could you tell us about how you designed it, how you conceived it, and maybe as well, could you say something about how it reflects the Texan landscape?
Well, I think everybody who remembers the presidency of George W. Bush and Mrs. Bush recall that when they came back to Texas and you saw them on television, they looked really relaxed, like they were happy to be here. But even before we were selected, the idea of being selected, and I was just, I'm a guy who grew up in a rural landscape myself, and I remember, obviously, the President and Mrs. Bush were happy to be home, but I also thought there was something about their connection to the landscape that was surrounding them. And I think when Mrs. Bush said that she wanted the grounds of the Presidential Center to be not a setting for the building, but a gift of the Texas landscape to the neighborhood and to the city and the region, she partly wanted to give them a chance to be in that landscape, not just to have a park to use, but a sense of being surrounded with what has historically belonged here. So I don't know if I gave away any secrets, except that the people who were behind the project had a very clear vision that they wanted it to be of Texas, but they wanted to provide the people that came here a very Texas experience by having it be made of not just native plants, but a functioning ecology, a microcosm of the larger Texas landscape.
I see. So I've always, when I visit the Presidential Library and the Presidential Center, I've always been curious about sort of this descending landform at the back of the garden that you have to go down so much. Is there anything special to know about that? Was that done on purpose with a particular objective?
It was a complete accident. So one of the things that's great about the building that the architects did is the building is really quite big, but it's embedded into the topography. So from the front, it actually looks like a kind of big one-story building. It looks bigger in the back. But to do that, we took a lot of soil. We made a very big hole, and for cost for cost-saving measures, but also as a creative possibility, we took that soil and we kind of built it up for sound protection from the interstate, but also to begin to give this sense of containment. But really what we were doing with the landscape going down was creating a microcosm of the draws and the ravines that exist in North Texas. And with that, of course, I wanted, Mrs. Bush was talking about seeing people out there, and I love the sense of release I see in people as they're going down in. They're surrounded entirely with landscape. This gives us microclimates that support the diversity of vegetation that we wanted to have out there, because some plants like a little more sun, some like a little less. And then the other is that the site, for energy reasons, naturally drains from the top behind us to the back, and so the descending topography makes it energy efficient.
Oh, that's actually very interesting. I very much like this idea that it's a microcosm of what you can see in the broader landscape of Texas. It's a wonderful idea and something I, honestly speaking, did not know, and so thank you for telling us about this. So is there anything, given that you've worked on this in so much detail, is there any part of the park that you like the most, and is there anything that maybe left you a little bit disappointed, or are you completely satisfied with what you did?
I'm not a person that's ever entirely satisfied, so, but I think that's a good edge to have.
Okay.
I love the seep. I love that it's to the right when you go out, and it's a place where so stepping back for a second, of course we do something great by collecting the rainwater and the runoff, in that we never use city water here for irrigation when irrigation is needed. We've basically used plants that only in rare occasions need irrigation. But the seep simulates something you find in North Texas as well, which are places where, groundwater is released very slowly through strata of the geology. And so for a short while after every rain, a little bit of water is released, not most of it because we save it for irrigation, but a little bit is released, and then you have it's the only time on this side of the garden that there's any expression of water, which is when stored rainwater is released back into the natural landscape. And you get this great little ecology over there. We planted some cottonwoods and other native trees, but we have maidenhair fern and some plants that only live in Texas in very moist, shady places. So it's a favorite. Disappointments. I'd say the only disappointment was, not surprisingly, some pieces were happier being planted here than others, and it took a little longer for some to fill in and kind of be fulfilling. I don't know if that's fair to be disappointed about, but
yeah, I would call that a learning.
Disappointment doesn't run in fair ways sometimes.
Yeah, I agree. One thing that Mrs. Bush mentioned was the Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center, and I was wondering, did you collaborate with them?
That was an amazing.
Actually achieve this beautiful garden?
Well, that was an amazing experience, and that's an incredible resource. One of the things that, well, first of all, I want to tell you something that is hard to know if you weren't part of it, but we actually built a piece of the landscape off-site and simulated the seeding and the restoration of the landscape a couple of years ahead of time, so that not just the President and Mrs. Bush, but so that everybody could kind of know what we were getting into. I think they also wanted to know that we really knew what we were doing. But I do that a lot with restoration projects where you make a patch and you look at it. The Ladybird people were an incredible part of that for us. And when we made the test, we didn't just do one, we did 3 or 4 different things. I think the coolest thing they did was they had done the research on the turf that Mrs. Bush described a few minutes ago of the 5 native species, and they'd been working with that, and the Presidential Center was the first time it was used extensively in a public site. So that was another thing they brought to the project.
Yes, I had also no idea how technical this seems. The way you describe the soil and how the watering is done, etc. It seems to me that you need to learn a lot about a particular location where you work. It's not something that you can't do the same type of project anywhere. You need to delve into all the details. One other question I had is, of course, when you build a garden, there's choices to be made, and some people may prefer some botanical garden with some exotic plants. And so how do you view the value of the native landscape and the native plants and flowers? Is that something that you feel strongly about, that it's a very good way of actually promoting green spaces?
Oh, I certainly do. I think one of the things that we work towards here, to pick up on one of your key words, this really isn't a collection of native plants. This is a functioning ecology. I don't think it's fair to say that it's a transplanted piece, but that's kind of what we were trying to do, to almost make it seem like this was a pre-existing landscape that the library or the center was built next to. We really weren't anxious that it felt, designed, or that people came here and thought so much about the shapes of the landscape as the experience that it provided.
Okay, now, you know, we've talked about the gardens here at the Bush Presidential Center. Could you tell us a little bit more about some of the large-scale urban projects you are currently involved in? Of course, in Dallas, people are very interested in the Trinity River project. What is your vision for that project? And there as well, how do you think to incorporate the natural habitat, and how is that important, for example, as it relates to flood management or flood control?
Mm-hmm. So the public park projects that we've been involved with for close to 30 years have, by coincidence, almost always been on the edges of rivers. But it seems like the older I get and the longer we're doing it, they get stranger. Maybe that's a fable of getting older, I don't know. But I'm just going to mention one. In Toronto, we're actually moving and redesigning and naturalizing the mouth of a river that runs through the city that was cut off for all kinds of 20th century engineering logic and put into a channel. And that's a project that I think a number of the things that we've learned here have found application there. But the Trinity is particularly unique and interesting. And I suppose many people in the audience know, but some don't, that to create the levees, the engineer and the designer who made it literally took a river that was over here and chopped it off and put it like, no, Mr. River, you're going to like come over here and you're going to be between the levees. And of course, very soon after the levees were completed, Dallas was saved from a 500-year flood that would have ravaged the city. So it's an amazing, it's fortuitous and amazing. What we're trying to do now is to imagine a way that we can make the floodway more usable. And obviously, you don't collaborate with nature. You don't take hints from nature. You do what you're told to do. Like, it's just like most of our relationship to our moms, or to my mom anyway. You don't do what you're told, there's far worse punishment than what would come from your father. And Mother Nature insists in the Trinity that we really understand what's happening there. Now, what's peculiar about it is that none of the water actually flows naturally. It's entirely regulated through a series of dams and reservoirs upstream, so it's very unusual. I would say, in a nutshell, I could describe our approach as this. The river currently occupies a small and very uncomfortable channel, and it wants to braid, it wants to move back and forth. Water turns over as it moves, and it doesn't do that now, and so it's eating away constantly. So the first thing we're doing is we're tipping back the banks to give the river more flexibility, and then in doing that, we're excavating new oxbows, artificial oxbows, if you will, so that as soon, like we're all aware when there's a big flood event, but actually almost every week there's some up and down of water down there. So these low oxbows, when you go down there, you'll be able to see the water moving around. It's just going to feel so much more appealing than the trench. Then we're taking the soil that we're digging out and we're piling it up to make hills in the floodway that will be above water up to the 10 or the 15-year storm, which are the most common storms. The very biggest storms, everything will go underwater, but that's the way it is along all the rivers in Texas. You know, that's just another, the trees, you plant the right trees, that's not a problem. Then, and then I'll finish, the levees are very, they're very off-putting when you're on the outside. You can't see in, they're very steep. So in two places, Where they're steep, we're grading back. We're bringing in a lot of fill so that when you're approaching from the city, and we do it from both sides, so absolutely democratic side to side of the river. It's a sloping, democratic in the sense of the founding of the country. It's very fair-minded in the way that the two sides invite you up. And then you come up and there's a little bridge and you go from the top of one of the landforms to the other, and you can actually go across the whole landscape and either choose to stay up or you can go down and enjoy the river. I know it's a little too long, but...
No, this is actually a little even too short maybe, because I know the audience is very, very interested in this. So how would you envision Dallas side being able to use that space when you say making it more usable, say in about 10 years? What is it that
5 years.
people, or maybe 5 years even, wonderful, what is it that people could expect?
Well, first of all, when we say the word people, it means so many different things. There's so many, like I think as soon as this happens, housing will spring up and people will move there, and sooner than they think they will, they'll have kids and they'll decide they want to stay. And they'll have these parks outside of the levees with playgrounds, and when you have the little guys with their little legs and the strollers and all the time it takes, you'll only probably use the parks that are near the city. But if you're a runner, or I'm a big walker on the weekends, I have that little thing on my phone that I pay too much attention to that tells me how many miles I walk. But I walk at least twice as far on a weekend day. And I think when we say people on the weekend, they will actually take up kind of moving through the whole park. Runners, obviously, and bikers moving faster will be at the scale of the Trinity. The area between the two Calatrava bridges is like 200 acres, which is, it's a lot. It's a fifth of Central Park. That's a very big piece of land. So to use the whole thing, you're moving fast. So I think a park is only good if everybody can find something to do there that they want to do. It's not really a park unless the bird watcher and the basketball player both find what they want to do.
Yeah, I think that's a very nice way to put it. And so maybe now it's a good time to bring James Farmer into the conversation. He's one of the leading garden specialists, in addition, of course, to being a great interior designer. And so we've heard some exciting things about large-scale urban projects, but what is it that we as individual citizens can do to sort of achieve some of these goals of bringing back native plants and taking care of our own backyards?
Sure. For me, I have an agrarian background. Farmer's not just a surname. We got the name somehow, doing something. But growing up in a small town in South Georgia, you knew where your food came from. You knew the peaches that you were eating, who grew those, the pecans, so on and so forth. And now that's very chic. It's farm to table. It's a lifestyle. You'll pay a lot of money for that, at a restaurant. However, there is, it's a bizarre form of ignorance when someone goes to a restaurant and pays a lot of money for a tomato that's an heirloom, and to not realize that you can grow it yourself, and to have that little bit of knowledge that you can, whether it's a large plot or a small plot, you can grow something that enriches your life any day. The sprig of mint we had in the iced tea at lunch, that was grown somewhere. I always go back to tomatoes in particular because my grandfather, he's a minister, and gardening was always his hobby and pastime. But one of my first memories is him holding me and him reaching and picking a ripe tomato and the smell of that vine. But the way then that tomato, along with its brothers and sisters that were on the vine, how they sat in a bowl on the kitchen counter, that was beautiful as well. And so that then brought in the interior aspect of it. And my grandmother then told me that we eat with our eyes first. And so here was this small little 10 by 10 plot in the backyard. We live on a big farm now, but that 10 by 10 plot of some okra and tomatoes and some squash, brought bounty and food, and it enriched our lives through the summertime. And it was just something that we think of as nostalgic, but at the same time, it's obtainable now. And it's kind of chic, too, to know where your food comes from.
Yeah, so that's very interesting. I mean, I come from a country, Belgium, where everybody pretty much grows their own vegetables. With us, it was, I think, a little more potatoes than tomatoes, but somehow I kind of didn't inherit that knowledge, and so I now live over here, and I feel that I don't know anything about gardening. I guess I wasn't a good son helping my father, but there's definitely a little bit of a knowledge barrier, and you make it sound very simple. Oh, you know, everybody can do something in their backyard.
Sure.
But I do think there's lots of people who would like to do something, but feel that there's a little bit of a barrier. What would you recommend?
Well, I'd recommend first just knowing a few things right offhand. I fortunately grew up gardening, connected to the land. But what was amazing about that is I had this aha moment. I call it actually a fried chicken moment, but I was in college and I was frying chicken in the dorm kitchen because naturally that's what every 18-year-old does when they go to college. But I'm frying chicken and my roommate decided to come eat, and then a couple other folks came over to eat, and I realized that my generation did not realize that you can grow something and you can cook it, or you can sow some zinnia seeds and put them in a mason jar or a silver julep cup, and there's beauty in that. So I had this idea that, you know what, you don't have to wait until you've worked 30 years and retire and start gardening. You can start gardening at any age. And I wanted to be a voice for my generation to say, y'all, you can plant it, you can cut it, you can cook with it. So I just started writing, and being of the generation where social media is a big part of our daily lives, I was able to blog about it. And then Facebook and Instagram allowed me to share that platform. But for me, it went back to a basic of a book. That's how I learned to garden, was one, trial and error, but also to read it in a book. The book says to sow these seeds after the last frost of winter, or to plant this at this particular time, and then the trial and error part. So if I wrote about my experiences with that as a young person, then I could educate and then also entertain my generation in doing that. So I like to take the veil away from gardening as it's something that you have to do in your maturity. Start young and teach your children where it comes from and how you were enriched and enlightened each and every day with what comes from. In the Deep South, you grow flowers in the yard and vegetables in the garden. So I say yard and garden, but if we need a translator, we can bring one in.
Yeah. Very good. So I would actually want to ask the same question that I asked Michael, which is what is your view of sort of more the native part, part of plants, and maybe even the birds in the garden and the insects in the garden, and what kind of role does that play in your way of thinking?
It plays a huge role, and it actually plays a role in all of our lives. If you had orange juice this morning with your breakfast, or berries with your yogurt, or the fruit we had with our salad at lunch, that was pollinated somehow. And there are bees that do that. There are insects that pollinate. Without those, we would starve. We wouldn't have the food that we eat each and every day. But I'll have to admit, I'm a lazy gardener. I mean, there's already so much to do. It's 110 degrees outside, and you just don't want to do so much of the work. Well, let the work be done for you with the plants. If you know what plants work in your zone, what plants are native, that's a huge help. I love when people say, you know, I'm on the altar guild at my church, and I cut these flowers, and I use them for Sunday, and people say, oh, you tended the zinnias all summer long. I didn't. I threw them out there, and they did the work. They like heat, they like sun, like a little bit of water. And then I go out and cut them and take them to church. So that makes me look like I've been doing something great all week long, but Sunday morning I just went and cut them. And so that little bit of knowledge is power, in knowing that you can plant something that's native or that thrives in your particular environment, and it does the work for you. And I believe that with pruning as well. When people think, oh, I've planted this, I have to cut it back every day, it's right at my front door. Well, you planted a tree at your front door. You didn't plant a small shrub. And so there's more time, there's more money, there's so much more energy spent in taking care of something that's improperly planted. And so knowing what grows in your zone, what's native to your area, and embracing that makes you look better.
Okay, well, great. Well, I'm going to try to get started. But so what do you say to someone who, you know, you obviously live on a farm and it actually looks very attractive. Maybe we should move there. But what do you tell someone who lives in a sort of more dense urban area, who maybe doesn't have a big backyard or lives in a condo and doesn't really have those possibilities? What can that person do?
It's a little rhyme. A pot or a plot, whatever you've got, you can grow something. One of my favorite stories is I was in a town north of here, New York. It's on up there, and I have some good friends who live in the city, and they had me over for dinner, and a lady came up to me and she was telling me about her garden, and I assumed that she must have a garden outside the city somewhere because she was talking about basil and herbs and a couple of tomatoes, and she had some mint, and she had mint tea every single morning. She was growing that on a balcony in New York, and I was just fascinated by that. So I told her, please share this with the group, and they were just could not believe that someone could grow something in such a small area as that. And I like to encourage that knowledge. Reading about something, think about what you like, and then embrace it. A little terracotta pot with a few seeds could do wonders, and it's amazingly fulfilling when you plant something and you grow it and you cut it or eat it and get to share it with people.
Wonderful. Now I would like to maybe shift the conversation a little bit and talk about the broader societal and economic benefits of conservation. So I'm going to put on my hat of an economist for a second here, and I'll say a couple of things. There is actually...
You want me to ask you some questions?
I like asking the questions. So what I wanted to emphasize here is that there is actually growing evidence that people, when they decide where they want to live, they're paying more and more attention to what we as economists call urban amenities. And those include, of course, the natural habitat, the natural environment, the green spaces, etc. And because people are paying more and more attention to it, businesses are also paying more attention to it. Why is that? Well, because, of course, businesses go where people want to go, right? Because businesses need people to work for them. And so that growing tendency reflects a change in our economy as well, because if you go back in time, maybe to maybe a century ago, when most of us were farmers, right? Then we didn't necessarily have a choice of where to live, because if you're employed in agriculture, you need to live where the land is fertile and where you can be productive. And even when you think about industrialization in the 19th century, that often happened close to energy sources, maybe where the coal fields were, etc. Nowadays, if you fast forward and you go to the modern economy, which is service-based, it can happen anywhere, right? So you don't need to be located in a particular place in order to be productive. And that implies that now people have more choice. They can kind of go where they want to go. And that means that living in a nice environment becomes a really determining factor of where people will live in the future, and it will be a determining factor of where businesses and employment will go in the future. And that, of course, also means that cities nowadays are competing for jobs, for employment, etc., using those types of factors, right? Using the natural environment, for example, as an attractive feature for businesses to come here. Let me give just one illustration of that. You all know, of course, that Amazon has called for a competition for its second headquarters, right? And if you look at the criteria that it has put forth, one of them is quality of life. And when they talk about quality of life, they actually talk about the natural environment. And why is that? Well, because they very explicitly say that they want to go to a place where people want to live. And again, in a modern economy that is service-based, we have a lot more choice of where we want to live. Right? And from that point of view, I would make a strong argument of saying that taking care of our natural environment, improving the green spaces, making our cities more attractive on a number of dimensions actually makes a lot of sense, not just from an environmental or an ecological point of view, which of course also it does, but also from a business or an economics point of view. And so I really believe that, in the next 20, 30 years, cities and urban environments who know or that know how to take care of their natural environment are going to be doing much better and are going to be able to compete for employment and compete for jobs. At least that's kind of my view as an urban economist. And so I would like to maybe, given that I'm the one who gets to ask the questions, let me ask my two panelists here what their views are on that. I mean, Michael, who've worked on so many interesting and exciting large-scale projects, how do you think about the broader societal and economic benefits that these types of projects bring to cities?
Well, I mean, we've certainly learned in like our Brooklyn Bridge project that a part of the Brooklyn waterfront that when we started planning it 20 years ago, people were saying, nobody will come there. Last year, 5 million visitors. Last weekend, it felt like there were 5 million visitors there. The first warm day that we've had. But I want to go one step back from your question, which is why has this sea shift happened? Why is it that in the valuation that people are saying about where they want to live, why have we reached a moment where this is becoming a higher concern? I don't know that I have the answer. I know that it's true, and I think it's because of the emphasis on the general emphasis on quality of life that's so much more, it is somewhat the consequence of our success as a society, but this isn't an American phenomenon. This is something that's going on all around the world that people, and I think it's interesting to think about what has shifted. And we can all think of some things, but it's like we've reached some tipping point. We've reached some tipping point where people have learned that for their life to be meaningful the way they want it to be, they want to have access to that. And it's not, it's across. What's so interesting in Brooklyn Bridge Park, I mean, we have 2.8 million people living in Brooklyn alone in New York City, and when you go there, it's not black and white and brown. It is literally, people from 80 or 100 nations around the world and every possible variation on religious beliefs, all being magnetically drawn to the edge. It's totally true that people want this, and it's interesting as funding for park projects has, begun to dry up, and that's not a reflection on the last year or two, but on the last 5 or 6 years, private philanthropy is tremendously shifting emphasis to putting private dollars into public amenity for the public good. It's interesting. I mean,
yes,
I think
the Clyde Warren Park here in Dallas is a very good example of that, right? I mean, it was mostly funded by private dollars.
I mean, I've worked on a couple of parks that are being built with public money, and the whole river project in Toronto is a consortium of public money, but most of the parks we're working on are privately funded now from foundations, and really big gifts, really big.
Yeah, that is actually incredible, and I think it's an amazing progression. And I think as an economist, we of course very often focus on jobs and employment, and that's one of the things I was emphasizing here, job creation. But of course, when we think about the more comprehensive well-being of a human being, it's obviously not just related to somebody's salary or her income or her wealth, but it's, living a fulfilling life. And that's why, maybe James, you who've worked so much in these types of micro gardens, could you tell us something about, for example, the psychological or maybe the aesthetic benefits from having a nice garden?
Sure, we crave beauty. It's an innate sense that we long for. I love that a garden reaches all the senses, all the emotions, and by garden, it's not many acres or small areas. It's just that tactile part of something green that does something. Whether it's studies showing how blood pressure is reduced in nursing facilities or hospitals when there are plants or in their gardens. If you're ill and you're looking out the window and you see either concrete blocks or a garden, just the benefits of that. We crave that. We crave beauty. We crave the ability to walk through a door, and whether it's a fern that's beside the door that greets us, that says, welcome home. I feel like what it is for my clients in particular is they want that separation between house and home. House is more structural, home tugs at the heartstrings. And part of that is the plantings, the gardens there in and of itself. So that craving beauty is to me, it's a basic human instinct and of something that we need. And I see that, whether it's your park, if Central Park's your only outlet for the outside, or it's your own 80 acres you live on for yourself. I think the opportunity to create that for people is a true honor, because you're able to translate something that they need, that they're longing for, and you're able to create that separation between house and home.
Yes, that's very inspiring. Let me maybe, we're getting slowly here to the end of our conversation. Maybe I wanted to circle back to something Mrs. Bush mentioned at the beginning here. There's more and more people, of course, living in urban environments, and urbanization and modernization go hand in hand, and this is happening all over the globe. In the next 50 years, the vast majority of humanity is going to live in cities, and not just cities, any city, probably in big cities, right? And so making those big cities livable and enjoyable, I think, is a big responsibility for all of us, and it will improve, I believe, our quality of life, and it will improve our well-being. And so all these efforts, both large scale and small scale, are extremely welcome. And of course, the great work that Mrs. Bush has done to promote some of these ideas in the public space, I think are very much to be applauded, because they're necessary, and I really believe they will become increasingly necessary in the future, again, because more and more people will be living in these urban environments. And as James said, this is what people crave at the end of the day. We don't want to live in hostile environments. It's part of our progress, right? As societies move forward, we want to also enjoy ourselves. We want to go beyond the simple measures of saying we just want to maximize, for example, our income, right? We want to have an environment that is sustainable and welcoming and enjoyable to live in, because, when we have leisure time, for example, we want to go to the park, and some people will want to run and others will want to play, and all of that makes the whole human experience more enjoyable. So I would like to now thank Mrs. Bush and thank our two panelists for joining us, and I hope you have a wonderful evening.
Gentlemen, thank you. I, for one, am inspired, and I am going to head straight home and dig up my backyard because Michael's already given us a beautiful park here, so I don't have that to contend with. While I'm digging up my backyard, you all are going to move out into the cross hall for a reception. I will also note for you that the museum is open, and I know that Mrs. Bush would appreciate it if you'd stop by and see our First Lady's exhibit. It is particularly well done, we think. And then dinner will follow in the American Airlines Pavilion after the reception. Thank you so much for coming.